Security Council, State Department, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and with the United Nations in Cambodia. Jaime appears regularly on national and international media and has syndicated columns and other writing on science, technology, and global affairs are featured in publications around the world. You may have seen Jaime a couple of weeks ago on 60 Minutes. He was on a program regarding the origin of the coronavirus in Wuhan. He is the author of A History of the Cambodian Genocide, the historical novel, The Depths of the Sea, the genetic sci-fi thrillers, Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata, and the recent bestseller, Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity. Jaime holds a PhD from Oxford, a law degree from Harvard Law School, and is a graduate of Brown University. This is actually Jaime's first opportunity to address an ethics and compliance audience. And so please join me in welcoming Jaime Metzl, What E&C Needs to Know About the Future. Welcome, Jaime.
Thank you so much, Ernie, and thank you so much, Pat. It's really my tremendous honor and pleasure to be here with all of you. When I was first asked, when I was first asked to give this talk, I really just jumped at the opportunity because the work that you all are doing could not be more important. I work in the world of tech and imagining where the future is heading. But one thing should be absolutely clear to all of us is that our technology, like our organizations and institutions, don't have value systems built in. It's up to us to infuse our best values into our technology, into our organizations, into our systems and institutions so that we can progress in a way that feels comfortable. It feels like the best of who and what we are. And so we don't wind up in some strange future where we feel alienated from ourselves and who we are and what we stand for. And the work that you all do, both collectively, but even more importantly in the trenches, every day in your companies, in your organizations, fighting to make sure that ethics and compliance are at the core of everything, really could not be more important. And if this were easy, if it was just all you had to do was establish some set of principles, send everybody a laminated card for their wallets, and just sit back and let our best ethical values infuse everything we do, we would live in a different world. But the truth of the matter is this is really complicated. We live in a world where humans have different types of instincts. Our organizations are pulled in different ways based on competitive and other pressures. And there are often times when making the right decision is hard. And even when it's not clear what the right decision is. And the work that you all are doing, again, individually and collectively, to try to systematize processes so we can all be as strategic and smart and inclusive as possible in that process of integration really could not be more important. And when we think about how to do it, there are really two big buckets of activity. One is starting to think about what does the future look like? We have to have a vision of where we're going in order to start planning of how we're going to operate and behave and function once we get there. But the other is to build the kinds of cultures and structures and systems that will make it easier for us individually and collectively to actually do the best and right thing when we get there. All of these issues are 100% clear in retrospect. At the end of World War II, everybody in France, it turns out, had been part of the resistance. Why is it that only some people were part of the resistance earlier? Because it was hard, it was complicated, it was compromising and dangerous for many people. And so that's the terrain that you guys know better than everybody else that this isn't easy. But how do we do that? And so in my talk today, I'd like to break my conversation into three real parts. One is thinking about where the future is heading, and the future is just going to happen, but what it's going to look like. The second, some broader issues of ethics that will arise in this new world. And third, some of the really challenging issues related to applied ethics, the kind of work that you guys are doing day in and day out. So first, when we think about technology at this incredible moment in history, a key thing for us to really understand deeply is this concept of exponential change. That word exponential is now repeated so often, it's become something of a cliche. But when we break it down, it becomes a little bit easier to understand what it is and what it means. 100 years ago, the global population was around 2 billion people, and about 20% of them were literate. That meant that about 400 million people, only 400 million people, had the opportunity to, in a meaningful way, participate in the world of shared knowledge. And that shared knowledge moved very, very slowly in those days, faster than it had before, but very, very slowly relative to today. Today, we have around 7 billion people. We have an 85% literacy rate. That means about 5.5 billion people are able to participate meaningfully in the world of shareable knowledge. But it's not just that we have this much larger number of people who are participating. In our ancestors' world, there was really important information that wasn't shared for thousands of years. And we should all remember from our anthropology and history classes that the copper and bronze and iron ages happened in different civilizations, sometimes thousands of years apart. What happens today if one of those 5.5 billion people come up with some incredible innovation? It is immediately shared in the networks, the communication networks that we have. And what does that mean? It means that for 5.5 billion people literate, and certainly even people who aren't literate have a lot to contribute, you need to wake up every day. You don't have to solve a problem that's already been solved. You don't have to, quote unquote, waste thousands of years trying to develop a recipe for copper that already exists. So everybody, every day, is solving new problems and pushing the boundaries of knowledge ever forward. And on top of that, what we're experiencing is not just one technology, not just a bunch of separate technologies, but a super convergence of multiple technologies. What does that mean? Well, we have the computer revolution. The computer revolution is making the machine learning revolution possible. The machine learning revolution is making the biology revolution possible because biology is way more complicated than we can understand alone with just the tool of our brains, in spite of the incredible complexity of our brains. And now we're entering a phase of biocomputing where our understanding of nature is circling back with using biology to design new computer chips, new ways of doing things that then are supercharging the AI revolution. You could go on and on and on. So it's not just any single revolution. All of these revolutions are feeding into and inspiring each other. And that's why this idea of exponentiality, what it essentially means is that the rate of change is accelerating because every new invention begets new invention. And with this super convergence, with more people coming online, more knowledge, that rate of change just speeds up continuously. And that's something that's really important and really challenging for all of us in all of our organizations, because in a world of accelerating change, the rate of change going forward is faster than the rate of change in the rearview mirror. And that has big implications for all of us and all of you, because as I said, thinking about how we're going to live in our world of ethics and compliance involves anticipating where the world is going to be, at least to do so with as much efficacy as possible. So in this talk, I could go on about many different of these super converging technologies. Certainly, the AI revolution is everywhere. It's touching every aspect of our lives. Nanotechnology, robotics, so many others. But I want to focus a little bit on the biology revolution. It's been said that if the 19th century was the century of chemistry and the 20th century, the century of physics, the 21st century is and will increasingly be the century of biology, where the tools of biology and our understanding of biology are going to help us in many ways reshape the world inside of us and around us. So I know that there are conversations about the vaccines happening over the course of this event. So I don't want to go into that in too great of detail, but maybe because it's so relevant and so personal for so many of us, maybe let me start with these mRNA vaccines as a metaphor for where we are now. So I can, if I were with you in person, I would say by a show of hands, but if I did that, I would say, well, how many of you have been injected with the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines? My guess is most of the people on this call, in this video call, have had one of those two vaccines. Although if you've had Johnson & Johnson, everything else, those are also all great vaccines. So what's happening with these vaccines? It's not like the polio vaccines, where in the first it was a dead virus and then later an attenuated live virus. What you have been injected with is information. The way your cells work is that in your every cell, except for some red blood cells, has a nucleus, which is the egg yolk, and the cytoplasm and the egg white. Your genome is in the egg yolk, but it needs to give instructions into the cytoplasm about how to make proteins, which is how our bodies function. But our genome doesn't leave the nucleus. So what does it do? It has a messenger, and it's called a messenger RNA, mRNA, that delivers that message to the cytoplasm, to the egg white, for how to make these proteins. And what the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are doing is hijacking that process by sending new instructions to your cells, not saying make something your genome wanted you to make, but instead to make something that has never before existed in your body. And that is to make the spike protein that exists around the SARS-CoV-2 virus. When you've all seen the little images of the virus, that's the little red thing, those red things that are sticking out. So your body is becoming a manufacturing site. It's making something that is not native to your body. And then your natural immune system is recognizing that foreign invader and attacking it. And that's how your immunity is happening. And the key message for all of this is that is essentially the essence of the genetics and biotechnology revolutions. Of all the species who have ever lived, our one species now suddenly has the increasing ability to read, write, and hack the code of life. And it is an awesome power that also comes with an incredibly awesome responsibility. And it's going to change many aspects of our lives, starting with healthcare, but way, way, way beyond healthcare. And the fundamental transformation we're going to experience in healthcare is moving from our world of generalized medicine based on population averages to precision medicine. And sorry, I hear some little knocking in the background, and here I don't know what it is, but hope you can bear with me. To precision medicine based on each person's individual biology. And so what does that mean? And many of you have heard of things like gene therapy and other tools which are based on having an understanding of each person's individual biology. So you can have drugs and other interventions that are designed to address your particular needs. Unlike our world of generalized medicine, where if you have a headache, you take a Tylenol and you find out if you're one of the people who could die from taking a Tylenol by taking a Tylenol. In our world of precision medicine, we know who you are, so we can tailor a treatment, whether it's for cancer or anything else, for your particular individualized needs. But how are we going to know who you are? It's not just by looking at you, although that's relevant. We'll need to get all sorts of information, biometric information, life history, but the most important piece of information that we're going to get from you will be your sequenced genome. And everybody will increasingly, all of us will have our genomes sequenced before birth or immediately after birth, or for those of us who are our age, if you haven't already done it, we'll soon be doing it as part of just routine healthcare. But having your sequenced genome alone isn't meaningful, because what we need to do is compare the genetic or genotypic information with your life or phenotypic information. It's the genes and then how the genes are expressed. And going back to what I said before about superconvergence, it's comparing those two that is allowing us to increasingly crack the code and understand the complexity of human and other biologies. And with that understanding, we're going to move from our world of precision medicine and health to our world of predictive medicine, healthcare, health, and life. And that's a whole different way of just imagining the human experience. It's not that we have a symptom and go to the doctor, but we can understand what opportunities we have, what threats that we may face, not just in healthcare, but well beyond healthcare. And that's why I always say healthcare is just the first station along the way of this journey. It's also going to fundamentally change the way that we think about human reproduction, moving from reproduction through sex to sexual reproduction with greater reliance on science, using tools like IVF and embryo in vitro fertilization and embryo screening. And increasingly, as I'll mention in just a little bit, and hopefully not right away, the genome editing of human embryos to address terrible, deadly genetic disorders, but that would, and very likely will, open the door to consideration of other types of applications. So we are on this roller coaster ride toward this new, in many ways, new world of thinking differently about how the human body functions. But the genetics and biotech revolutions go way beyond human health. Many of you may have heard about some of the incredible innovations that are happening in agriculture, for example, where there are new ways of thinking about soil health, the ways about delivering nutrients to plants that don't involve fertilizers, which are extremely expensive, environmentally costly, wasteful, environment poisoning, but that work to transform the microenvironment, the microbiome connected to plant roots. Maybe you've heard about issues like cellular agriculture, growing meat essentially in bioreactors. And that may scare a lot of people and may sound unnatural, but it's certainly not so natural that we have so many billions of cows and chickens that we are creating and then having to have just an enormous agricultural footprint, land footprint, energy footprint. It's extremely harmful and stress-inducing and ultimately deadly for the animals. And we have all kinds of diseases, human diseases, that are being spread through this type of agriculture. We're seeing that, and maybe you have heard of these different companies that are starting in the cellular meat, precision fermentation world, more plant-based, genetically altered. And again, this scares people because people feel like, well, this sounds like frankenfoods. And yes, it's true. We're going to be, and we already are, applying science to our foods, and that's going to increase. And the question is not science or no science. We already live in a world where our entire diet is completely defined by science. Agriculture is science. It's not the same as our ancestors foraging in the woods. The question is, what science? How do we apply it? How do we apply it safely and carefully and ethically, as you all are so focused on, and rightfully so? These same tools of precision fermentation will transform fundamentally the way that we think about material inputs into our economy. That right now we have an extractive model. If there are certain things, we dig holes, we cut down trees, we do all sorts of things to get materials, and the footprint of our species is destroying our planet. But we are moving from a world of extraction to a world of growing. Everyone is familiar with beer and how we make beer. But right now we're entering a world where we can brew things like plastics, like spider silk, like leather, like construction materials, like energy. And then data storage. Yes, we have these wonderful advances in silicon for data storage that are allowing us to have the conversation we're having right now. But DNA is 1,000,000 times denser than silicon. We just had a sequencing of a mammoth that was 1,000,000 years old. Try getting your iPhone 1,000,000 years from now and seeing if there's any piece of it that would be readable. So we are over time going to shift and think about biology as a form of data storage. And that's ultimately what biology is. Biology is information technology. And as I said before, our technology, our species that's the essence of this revolution, is now has the ability to read, write, and hack the code of life. As I know you're all thinking, because you're who you are, the ethical issues surrounding all of this are monumental on so many levels. I can't go into all of them now because they're so multifaceted. But these issues, and I could give this exact same talk for AI or robotics or nanotechnology, but the ethical issues, I think would all be in similar buckets. One is equity. Who has access to these technologies, and how do we make sure that, one, we have equitable access because it's the right thing to do, but two, we have equitable access so that we can make sure that these technologies advance in a way that's comfortable and familiar to us. We have so many examples from history of one society developing some big advantage and using it to suppress other societies or to do things that we don't want. And as I said before, because this is about infusing our technology and our structures and systems with values, now is the time to do it. Diversity is another issue, and diversity, it really across everything that I've described. We tend to think of diversity as a way to have better outcomes in our universities and in our workplaces, and that's certainly true. But from an evolutionary perspective, diversity is the sole survival strategy of our species. If we didn't have the kind of diversity, if biology didn't have the kind of diversity that it has, and that's what Darwinian evolution is. Random mutation means the constant generation of diversity. That's why we're here. That's why evolution happens. It's why biology works. If we reduce our diversity, even in the name of doing things that may sound on their face good, like eliminating deadly genetic disorders or increasing agricultural yields because we're moving toward 10 billion humans, if we reduce our diversity and aren't mindful of that, we have a real danger of crashing our ecosystems, whether it's the ecosystem of the survival of our species or of our planet. Again, that doesn't mean that we are in a science yes or no situation, but it does mean that the question for us is science how? Science guided by what values? And because we are on this path of exponential change, these questions are going to become more intense, and they are going to show up in all of your labs, in all of your organizations, far sooner than I think it now seems, at least to many people. I just want to give two examples of how I've spent these last year and a half or 2 years that I think give an example. So as Ernie mentioned, I'm a member of the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. Dr. Tedros, my friend, the Director General of the World Health Organization, created our committee immediately after He Jiankui, the Chinese biophysicist, announced that the world's first 2 CRISPR babies had been born in China. In Hacking Darwin, in an earlier version of the book, I had predicted that it would happen. I had said it would almost certainly happen in China. And so I very quickly edited, made a few additional sentences saying, well, the thing that I had predicted has now happened, and here's what it means. But our committee, we've been meeting for 2 years. Actually, we're going to be issuing our report next month. And the question is, how do we govern this perhaps one of the most powerful technologies in human history, the ability to edit the genome of pre-implanted human embryos to transform some aspects of life? And again, it's not a yes or no, because every day we have children born with deadly, painful genetic disorders. And it's at least my view that if we can responsibly change the health span of somebody with one of these disorders from 3 painful years to 90 years of contribution, of love, of poetry, like, we should do that. But that doesn't mean that if we do one thing, we should be able to do everything. Other people may have different views, but that's certainly my view. But as we've dug into this issue of governance, it's become absolutely clear that governance is about systems. It's not, and it's the same in your organizations. It's not about having one rule and everybody following that rule. I mean, sometimes you need those kinds of hard and fast rules. But it's about thinking, well, how are decisions made really at every level? And how do we build the kinds of structures, the kinds of cultures that will make it easier for people to live lives and behave in ways that are guided by our best ethical values? And it's not easy. If it were easy, it probably would have been done. And it's never-ending work. And you guys know this because that is the world that you're in. The second thing that I've been in many ways consumed with over the last year and a half, as Ernie mentioned, is my work on COVID origins. As a person with a background in both science and in China and Asian affairs, something didn't seem right to me in the earliest days of the pandemic, when it felt like a story was being crammed down our throats that COVID-19 started in a wet market in Wuhan. But it was pretty clear to me in January of last year that that wasn't the case. And not only that, I knew that the Chinese authorities knew that that wasn't the case, because it was published science that 40% of the first cases of COVID-19 had absolutely no exposure to that market. And yet I was asking, well, why is it that the Chinese government is pushing out this story so aggressively? And why is it that even some prominent scientists in the West in February of last year were so aggressively saying that's the story, and anybody who would even raise a question that this should be considered is a quote unquote conspiracy theorist. And so for me, when I first started speaking out in February of last year, I was really worried because I certainly treasure my relationship with the World Health Organization. I didn't want to be called a conspiracy theorist by 20 Nobel laureates. That's not a comfortable place to be. My reputation is very important to me, but it just seemed wrong that there seemed to be such a concerted effort to try to start the process with the desirable outcome, rather than use the scientific method to examine all of the hypotheses and see where the data took us. And so I started speaking out about it, and I was really aggressively attacked, but stuck to my guns, and over the course of all of last year, in many ways was vilified. And this year, though, things started to change pretty significantly. My writing started to get a lot of attention. I led a process of experts around the world who we had found each other over the course of last year and congealed into a community with 2 open letters calling for a full investigation into all COVID origin hypotheses. They were featured in pretty much every major newspaper around the world: the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. And then I was extremely pleased, because remember, I had said how worried I was about my relationship with the World Health Organization. But after a really disastrous and frankly dishonest press event between an independent international committee and their Chinese government counterparts in Wuhan on February 9th, and then they issued their report some weeks later, the Director General of the World Health Organization came out and essentially refuted that report and said essentially what I had been saying since the earliest days of the pandemic, is that we need a data-driven scientific process that asks the tough questions, because only by asking the tough questions can we prioritize our response for what comes next. So this is just two examples from my life, but it's these kinds of things. Again, it's raising these issues is never easy. It's always hard. And that's why having the kind of protections, I know you have a session later in this conference on whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are always vilified. Whistleblowers are always isolated. I actually, I mean, it was kind of crazy, but a week and a half ago, I was personally condemned by the spokesman of the Chinese Foreign Ministry from the podium in Beijing, personally and by name. So it's hard. But that's how do we think about building the kind of culture that can allow people to step up and to allow institutions to do the right thing of not just doing everything that every whistleblower wants to do, but of raising the tough questions in a responsible and inclusive and honest and accountable way. So that leads me just to the final part of my talk, is how do we think about applied ethics? How do we think about the principles and the big challenges that we're going to need to face in the future? And again, I can't be encyclopedic. I'm just going to raise a few points, and I'd love to hear from you after your thoughts. And I'm sure there are 1,000 things that I won't raise, but a few things that are on my mind, and things that I think will fundamentally influence all of your organizations. The first is, what's the role of humans in a world of galloping technology? What does it mean to be a human being? Right now, there are many functions that we do that machines can do better than us. But can we get to a place where it's not humans versus machines, but humans and machines, where machines do things that they can do best and humans do things that we can do best? And how do we think about structuring our environments so we can encourage people to be the best humans possible? And I think that's the win-win situation, but it's really hard. And the near-term manifestations are disruptions. So how do we think about that? How do we think about categorizing these kinds of what we have maybe traditionally called soft skills? The machines are really great at pattern recognition, but humans are really great at creativity, at emotional connection, all of these kinds of things. How do we think about transitioning our organizations in those kinds of directions? Data. How do we think about data? We are living in a data-driven world. I talked about understanding the genome through massive data pools. We need those massive data pools to understand the genome, which is the key to unlocking these incredible health potentials to cure and prevent the worst diseases. But there's a real danger that if we're not careful, these massive data sets and genetic data sets could be abused in ways that harm us. Actually, we're seeing that in places like Xinjiang today. And so how do we think about that balance? And again, it's going to show up in every one of your organizations. Now, with lots of people working from home, companies are going to want to keep tabs on what people are doing, whether people are working, but how are they going to do that in ways that respect the corporation's needs and the needs of the individuals? And I keep coming back to these issues of culture and systems, but at the end of the day, that's everything. I think you guys know more certainly than I do about how do we build a culture of people where ethics and compliance are at the center of everything, so we don't have these kinds of terrible lapses. But that same cultural issue now needs to be woven into technologies and systems, because there won't always be a human making every decision, but there will, for now, be a human who is making big decisions about structures, about data design and things like that. And so how do we think about ethics and compliance in a systemic way. And the two kind of core points, and maybe I'll end with these. First is that while the technology is new, the values that we need to use the technology wisely are in many ways old. And the key for us is, how do we make sure that our most cherished values guide the application of our most powerful technologies? Given what I've said about reproduction, you'll be surprised to learn I was invited by the Vatican first to speak at the Vatican just before the pandemic, and actually again in 2 weeks. But then also they commissioned a written piece from me on the ethics of human genome editing. And that was what I said there. How do we make sure that we can integrate our most cherished values? Because again, technology doesn't come with its own value system. It's up to us to infuse our values into our technologies, into our systems, into our cultures. And the final point is community. Again, the reason why I'm so happy to be here with you all today is none of us can do this on our own. We're all grappling. We're all grappling in the dark in many ways. And the way that we can find the best way forward is by sharing ideas, sharing experiences, so that when we start to face new and novel situations, they won't be so novel. We talked about vaccines and we're being inoculated with these vaccines. We also need to be inoculated with systems, with structures, with values, with common understandings, so that when these new and seemingly weird and novel circumstances arise, we know who we are and what we stand for, and we can behave accordingly. So let me stop there, and Ernie, over to you, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts and answering any questions you may have.
That's great, Jaime. Fascinating presentation, and I want to jump right into the questions. And so I'm going to start with the science questions, and then we'll move quickly into some of the ethics questions. Let's see here. We've got so much chat here.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Will these vaccinations cause viral resistance to any infections that will arrive in the future?
So 2 points. One, these vaccines are very safe. But two, by definition, they are new because they move forward so quickly in this emergency environment. Viruses would not have existed for billions of years if they weren't wily little buggers. And so right now we're seeing that the viruses are variating, which is what viruses do, and it's expected. And so far, the early indications are that the vaccines are holding. There's some concern about the South African variant breaking through the vaccines with some very preliminary evidence out of Israel. But this is a counterpoint. And so if it's quite likely that over time, there will be variants of this virus that can get around our defenses. But we are quite fortunate to be at a phase of our historical development where we have these incredible tools to respond. So I'm very confident that when that happens, we will have boosters in order to help us respond. And we're building this massive production and application base for the vaccines and for giving people the vaccines, that it's not going to go away. It's not that we're going to mobilize and demobilize. This is kind of a forever mobilization. And the speed with which we can develop these vaccines or boosters is just incredible. From the time Moderna received the sequence genome of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to the time that they developed the formula that is the Moderna vaccine that many of us have in our bodies, it was 48 hours, and it was 2 months from that moment to when the first human trials began. So we're going to see if the variants are worse, that we'll have a whole, just like with flu shots, but it'll be much faster and quicker. And frankly, it'll revolutionize the flu shots, because flu shots generally have about a 6-month lead time based on, at least for us in the United States, guesses based on the flu season in Australia mostly. And now we will be able to turn things around in a matter of weeks. So I think our flu shots will actually get better.
You know, you talked about the role of collaboration. Do you think that the collaboration was one of the things that really sped along the development of the vaccines? Was that the extraordinary element that we sometimes don't attribute, not just the science, but the collaborative aspect?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really been incredible across the board. I mean, first, when we go back, at least for the mRNA vaccines, I mean, this is decades. I think some people may have read about the Hungarian American woman who was making the case for the mRNA platform for decades and couldn't get funding for it at the University of Pennsylvania. But there was incredible scientific collaboration in the earliest days of the pandemic. We've seen a whole new way of thinking about scientific publication. So lots of relevant publications were just put up online through special websites before peer review, allowing for that kind of sharing. We look at these vaccines and really across the board. These are all massive collaborations between all kinds of countries, but certainly UK, Spain, United States, Germany, and others. And so I think it's exciting, and it's connected to that point of exponential change, because this kind of collaboration is just really pushing our advancement forward on so many different fronts.
Thank you. What about the effect of disinformation, the challenges that we have in terms of social media and just disinformation campaigns in general? How does that affect the use of science?
It's so significant. It's really important. I mean, I can't see everybody here, but I am guessing, based on your status within your organizations, that everybody is, maybe around roughly my age. So we all remember those early days when there were mediators. I mean, some of you remember the Walter Cronkites, the world where there were 3 television stations, and so there were these gatekeepers that were in some ways quality control, but they were also gatekeepers. And now we don't have those gatekeepers, and that allows for all kinds of great things, like faster collaboration, like even the work that I'm doing with maybe 36 experts around the world on COVID origins. We weren't happy with what our governments or the United Nations, which is by design run by governments, or even some of the lead science publications like Nature were doing. So we just came together on our own, and we do really intense virtual academic conferences where we're presenting data, challenging each other, presenting papers. But there's also an incredible opportunity for disinformation. And because our political systems in many places have gone kind of populist, that misinformation has been weaponized, as we've seen through various elections and other things. So I do think that we will need stronger governance systems around these common spaces, and it will no longer, it will no longer be possible to say, oh, that's an internet company. Oh, so we couldn't imagine regulating them. This, just as for hotels and other things and common spaces, we have regulations that allow for the kinds of interactions that we think are conducive to serve our democracy. We're going to need those in our social media and digital spaces. but it's going to require a lot of work. And I'm sure that issue parallels what many of you may be seeing in your organization, where you want to have free speech and open communications, and yet there have to be some kind of boundaries for what is and isn't okay, because the consequence of too great of misinformation, or just without not having any kind of legitimate governance mechanisms over the message, it could be very harmful for any organization, no matter how good the work that they're doing.
And it seems like that this kind of strikes at the core of trust. Trust being an issue for the advancement of all scientific work. And any other thoughts about what can be done to recapture that?
Yeah, I mean,
or to cultivate trust.
Yeah, trust is so essential for our organizations. We need our employees to trust the organization. For governance, that there are lots of countries, for example, that have great constitutions, great laws. In some countries, those constitutions and laws are implemented, and others they're not. And trust really stands at the core of that. And trust is a two-way street, that we have mutual responsibilities that have to be realized, and it's really complicated. I mean, I didn't mention this, but I'm also, in this crazy pandemic year and a half, I've also become the founder of a global social movement called One Shared World. The URL is oneshared.world. And we're all about the mutual responsibilities of interdependence, which is about trust, which is about this message, which I think is a reality of our time, is that each of our health and well-being reside in the health and well-being of everybody else on this planet. Our species has very rapidly gone from a bunch of small and mostly independent bands of roving nomads to this global species with a global reach, but there's a mismatch between the global nature of our problems and the structures and institutions and norms available to us for solving those problems. And we're doing, in 2 weeks, we're doing a big event with Tedros and many others on vaccine nationalism, which is it's a key example of this. If we build walls and just vaccinate ourselves, and we don't recognize that our fate is connected to other people, and that we need to have a global strategy for addressing a global problem, eventually our walls won't protect us. And that's about trust, is can we trust each other? Can we build systems and structures around trust, around mutual responsibility, not just because it's the right thing to do and makes us feel good, but because it actually, over time, I at least believe, will prove to be the best and smartest way to organize ourselves to solve our biggest problems.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been struck by is the incredible scientific advancement of being able to innovate around the creation of these vaccines in a short period of time, as well as what we just saw a couple of days ago, where we are able to fly a small 19-inch, 4-pound helicopter for 39 seconds on another planet. And but I bump that up against the challenges we've even had in distributing the vaccine to other parts of the world, and how that's really counterproductive. And so it is challenging to think about, has technology outstripped our ability to actually manage?
Yeah. And on that, I feel very strongly that it hasn't. Human beings, we've faced all kinds of big challenges before. The way that we are living now is fundamentally different from how our ancestors lived, and they couldn't have imagined anything that we do. So I don't think there's anything inherent in the technology that makes this kind of cooperation and collaboration possible. It's just, we have to imagine what it looks like and start building that world. And again, it comes back to, well, that's the kind of, each of us has a responsibility to do our bit. and I can think of few people who are better positioned to do that than ethics and compliance officers in some of the world's most important and powerful companies. It's not just you, but I think we all need to start where we are.
One of the quotes from your book that I really like, and I've run across it in a couple of other places, was that one by William Gibson. The future has arrived; it's just not distributed equally. And thinking about ethics and the technology that exists out there, or the next things that are coming, given the mission of our organizations, ethics and compliance around training, communications, risk management, the reporting and the handling of misconduct investigations. Do you have any thoughts in terms of maybe some innovations that are out there that may have more immediate impact? For example, mobile technologies. What I understand is anticipatory computing, being able to assist us in making better decisions.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, certainly all the things that you mentioned, Ernie, I mean, those are kind of the nuts and bolts of how to build this. There's a big vision, and it has to happen through specifics. So it's a big and broad question. But what I would say is that we need to be open to learning from places that don't seem like the exact places where we would learn. That there are a lot of examples outside of the corporate world, in biology, in other places that are really relevant to us. When in 1953, Commodore Perry opened up forcibly trade with Japan, with the black ships. And in 1853. In 1868, there was the Meiji Restoration, which was in Japan, which was the beginning of the reform process. But what they did, the reason why Japan was able to progress so rapidly, is they had study teams. They sent them all around the world to say, well, what are the most interesting innovations that other countries are doing? And then bring them back, and then they adapted them for Japan. And that was why Japan was able to leapfrog. The same is true with our organizations. I mean, right now, there's a lot of opportunity to learn lessons from organizations or entities that don't seem entirely analogous to us. And I think that the Ethics and Compliance Initiative could actually, and I know this is what you do, but play a really important role in being a clearinghouse for these kinds of interesting ideas. Because for every one, I mean, there's an analog for every one of those functions that you described, Ernie, that not just other companies, other governments, other organizations are struggling with. So this, I mean, I know this is my answer to your question. It's a big question, and my answer is a little bit fuzzy. But in the world where things are changing so rapidly, we all need to be really aggressive and creative learners, and that's the key to everything. And we need to look deeply for innovations and be creative about where we find them.
And we also need to get more comfortable with uncertainty.
Yeah,
which seems to go against our genetic code, because I think, from an evolutionary perspective, I mean, we don't like uncertainty. We never have. It makes us feel anxious. It's hard to lean into change, and change is coming, as you mentioned, at kind of an incredible rate now. Any thoughts about, I mean, do we need to genetically change ourselves so that we no longer are averse to uncertainty, but we embrace
it's connected to what I said before. I mean, humans, we are very flexible creatures. Our biology is exactly the same as our ancestors from 25,000 years ago. We live radically different lives, and all these things that seem pretty normal to us. I mean, even the fact that we're talking together on a video call with 282 people around the country and the world, it's like, oh yeah, well, that's just Zoom. Well, talk to your ancestors 25,000 years ago. It's magic. And so we're living in a world of magic. And people heard what I said about genetic enhancement of humans and say, well, that sounds crazy. We're all vaccinated. That's magic. Some of us are cyborgs with cochlear implants or pacemakers. It's magic. We live in a world of magic, and our species is a species that creates magic. But the question is, how? So we're geared for this kind of change. There's a bit of a mismatch between the way that our brains have evolved for linear thinking and the need for exponential thinking to kind of get around that. But we have tools for doing that. That's why people like me, my science fiction writer, for exactly that reason, to say, all right, everybody has a science fiction writer in them. Maybe we need to think a little more like science fiction writers in imagining their future. We have it in us, but we really need to focus on it. And we need to, again, coming back to what I said earlier, we need to really think, well, what are the things that humans can do really well? And let's focus on those. And if there are things that machines can do better than us, let's smartly oversee the machines. Because I think we need to be efficient with our time and energy in order to do exactly what you described, Ernie.
So, kind of concluding our time today, what makes you really hopeful in terms of looking at the future, and what makes you cautious?
Yeah. So I'm generally, as maybe you can tell, a very hopeful person. I mean, our species, we've gone through hell over the years. I mean, we've been almost wiped out through starvation multiple times in our history, getting down to the point where there were just a few hundred Homo sapiens left around 75,000 years ago in the southern tip of Africa. We've gone through horrific wars and plagues, and somehow we keep coming back. And I talked about genetic inheritance, but we have cultural inheritance, and cultural inheritance is as or even more important. And so we have our species has the ability to do wonderful things. We've done wonderful things. Those wonderful things tend to accrue. And so even after catastrophes, you can still hopefully dig out the old books, learn what you know, keep these traditions going. And that's what we've done. But I also worry that the dangers are mounting, and the dangers are decentralizing. And so the ability to do very significant harm is now distributed among lots of people, even almost at the individual level. And I'm worried that things like autonomous killer robots or other systems, we could lose control of them in really dangerous ways. I mean, we're not thinking about nuclear proliferation now because we're in the middle of a pandemic. But if we had the exact same pattern, but the starting point had been an accidental nuclear detonation somewhere, we'd be having all of these conversations and saying, oh, the issue is arms control. And we wouldn't be focusing on pandemics. So I think what we need to do is, as I said earlier, really recognize that we have these global opportunities, and we talked about connectivity and innovation, but these come with challenges. And the name of the game is, how do we optimize the upsides and minimize the risks? And I know that's what your organization, your community is all about.
Well, thank you so much for being with us, Jaime. We couldn't get to all of the questions, but it's been very stimulating and engaging for our community of practice. And we appreciate you being here and the collaboration.
It's really my great pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. And so this concludes our keynote, and our next session is 15 minutes at the water cooler. So enjoy that time before we actually have our first 3 breakout sessions at 1/4 till the top of the hour. Thank you again, Jaime.
All right. Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thanks, everybody.